welcome to Latino Game Changers episode 2. Today we're going to be chatting with
Javaria Abbasi. I'm the cultural and historical consultant for Dream of Darkness and a PhD student at the University of Oxford.
and I'm Rosie Pena. I'm the audio trainee here at Jaguar Games, and I'll be your host for today. So I've heard a lot about Javaria, so I'm extremely excited to be talking with her today. So I guess my first question would be, what interested you so much about like Latinx culture that made you want to study it?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things. I think that first, growing up in Virginia, where there's a lot of refugee and or sanctuary cities, I think there was a lot of proximity to a lot of Latinx individuals. And I think that someone who grew up under the era of the Patriot Act with a lot of the discrimination against Muslim individuals, I think there was a lot of like immediate cultural and historical resonances and the experiences of Latinx peoples in the United States and the experiences of Muslims and other brown people in the United States. So I think that I just was drawn to a lot of like friends who were Latinx, and also like my Spanish teacher was a big influence in elementary school for that.
I love that. So you grew up in a place that was very diverse then.
Mhm.
Um, so continuing on that, I feel like you growing up in a place like that, you firsthand get to experience and get to know Latinx people. So in your own words, how would you describe an authentic Latinx character that you've seen in a video game?
Yeah, so I think that there's a few questions within the question. So I think that I'll just break it down and answer it that way. The first is like, what is historical and or contemporary authenticity? Like, what does it mean for someone to be a real representation of a certain culture? And I think that as someone who is obviously not Latinx, I'm not qualified to be an arbiter of what is or is not authentic. However, I think as a historian, I can argue that most video games are not ever going to be completely authentic, right? Selective authenticity is incredibly important because you have to balance both conveying a historical period, moment, and what's realistic in that moment, but also something that's entertaining and is a means of entertainment primarily. So gameplay maybe won't always be completely realistic to the options you would have had in a given moment, but there has to be an entertainment factor. And I think that a lot of video games that are working on historical characters struggle to find that balance. And I think something that I particularly really like about Dream of Darkness, or what Jaguar Games is doing, is that they work with people who are already historians or archaeologists or experts in a certain kind of indigenous culture, whether this be people who are language instructors or people from an indigenous community themselves, in order to inform their building of a lot of the characters. I think for me, because my specific focus as a PhD student is indigenous oral history, I'm less qualified to speak to the question of like Latinx characters, but I can speak to the question of indigenous characters. And I think the first encounter I had with an indigenous character in a video game was Assassin's Creed 3, I believe, where you have a character who is of dual British and indigenous descent. And I think it was the first video game that I had seen that had done some level of historical research, but still lacked input from the indigenous community itself. And I think that that's something that draws me a lot to Jaguar Games' initiative, where we have both a language instructor like Akitzin, but also someone from the Guerrero indigenous community like Alberto.
No, yeah, that brings me back to last episode when I was talking to Javier about, Latinx culture, history, and everything that has to do with it in the video games industry. I think he had asked me where I'd like to see sort of the game industry and Latinx go, as in uh, referring to Latinx characters. And I think he had asked me if I remember like a Latinx character in video games that I've played. And now that you mentioned it and you mentioned Assassin's Creed, I can't really think of a character that was Latinx and that I played and I thought was very well done. But I think Resident Evil had Carlos Oliveira, and I think they did him very well. Um, but kind of piggybacking on that, I think throughout the gaming history, Latinx representation kind of has been minimal and sometimes stereotypical. And I think it's very considerate of you saying that you feel you're not like in the right place to be able to say if they're done authentically or not. Because I feel a lot of people in the industry sort of when they put in these Latinx characters, they don't really care and they're just kind of let's just put it in there for representation's sake without even doing the research and stuff. So I think that's very important that you bring that up.
I mean, as someone who has seen the problems with Muslim representation, particularly during the War on Terror, of just like the Muslim terrorist as an archetype, I don't think that all representation is good representation. So I think that's something our game tries to do very differently, which is if we're going to represent a culture, we do our due diligence by speaking with and augmenting the voices of people who are already in that culture, trying to portray their own culture positively.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I think, just like you said, I love that about Jaguar Games that we're taking it seriously. We're taking our time to find experts, find the historical accuracy and putting it in the game instead of just kind of being like, well, this is what it looked like. Let's just put it in there just so we have it and just for representation's sake again. So I guess kind of building on that, what do you think is something that the industry in that aspect of representation could work on?
Yeah, I think there's a few things. I think the first is when looking at video games, obviously there's multiple components. There's character design, there's audio design, narrative design, historical design, cultural design, and all of these things have to work together in order to make a game, particularly a historical video game, work. So if you have a really good character design but horrible narrative design, your game falls apart. If you have really good narrative and even, let's say, character design, but your audio just doesn't match the historical period, that really hurts immersion. And I think that's something the industry has recently struggled with is less character design and actually more narrative design when it comes to writing the stories in the voices of characters who are different from perhaps your typical game developer. So, for example, if you're writing an indigenous woman like our character Marina, Doña Marina or Malintzin, I think it's important to not only refer to historical sources written by American academics or British academics, but also to engage with perspectives of indigenous women themselves. So I think that, for example, for me, when I was writing a psychological profile for Malitzin's character and we were doing the audio design, I remember referring a lot back to some of the precepts that Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui, who herself is Aymara, but who is a very big scholar in indigenous studies, talks about. And for her, she argued that one of the biggest issues in many industries that try to become diverse or try to accept difference is that they pretend like they're inventing the wheel. That is, they pretend as if no one has done what they've done before, and there was no previous research or previous insight to build upon. I think that's something that video games have done poorly in that regard is engaging indigenous voices. It doesn't matter what culture. So if you're making a video game, let's say about the Ottoman Empire, are you actually going and consulting with archivists in Turkey? If you're making a video game about South Asia, have you contacted any people in South Asia and looked at that? And I think what our video game does differently is we use a lot of codices, we use a lot of accounts which are disputed, but of to some extent indigenous authorship in order to augment what already exists. We're not pretending like indigenous history that there was this discontinuity, that it was erased and then we're uncovering something. We're showing that this history has always been there and we're just highlighting it. And I think that's something the industry, especially in historical games, has to do better.
Definitely. That's I love that. I love everything you said. I think doing it well means actually putting in the effort to learn the culture, understand it, represent it. authentically, I guess, and having respect for it. And I think that that's exactly what I think, like you said, games, mostly in the industry, I think if people want to make games that are um, historically accurate, you know, put in the work and not just kind of, like you said, like, oh, this is something we discovered, like that's, and kind of making a big deal out of it. I think also, like you said, not reinventing the wheel. I think kind of bringing to light something that's always existed and putting it in the spotlight. Like, let's say, like, we're making a game about Mayans and Aztecs before the Spanish era. And I think that that's a really cool and great idea to kind of explore and see what was it like back then and learning about it at the same time. So I guess kind of building on that question, um, why do you think it's so important to do these sort of games well? Why do you think it's important that we do the sort of Latinx representation in a good way? And I think you kind of touched upon it like a couple questions ago. But yeah.
I think I have two responses. The first is I think I will speak specifically to the Mexican context and perhaps not Latinx more broadly because my PhD is in colonial Mexican history and literature. And I think that it's important to note that around the time of Mexican independence, and even a little bit before that, with the Criollo and Creole patron movements, there was this impetus to distinguish those of Spanish, what they would call people who were born of Spanish or white ancestry in Mexico from indigenous peoples. That is to say, you wanted to be able to show that you had a connection to a kind of indigenous past without being an Indio or without being indigenous. Because the idea of being indigenous in a caste system that is, and cultural stereotypes that have persisted was considered unsavory, savage, barbaric, etc. And I think in that context specifically, when you are showing a history of colonization, of these things, it's incredibly important not to reify or to fall into some of those post independence tropes again. Not only do you not want to reproduce conquistador accounts exclusively as like the true history, that is why we always balance them with indigenous accounts, but you also, I think, have to understand the milieu of the country you're producing about in the moment. That is to say, what are the lives of indigenous peoples today? These are living extant communities. And I think our game does a really good job of being like, what are our responsibilities to those communities when we represent them? Which is something that I think a lot of game developers have to continue to look at today. That just because you're looking at a historical moment, these are ancestors of people who live today. So you do have a responsibility to consult them and to not, I mean, if you look at the Indigenous Year through UNICEF, there's no about us without us, right? And I think that's something that's incredibly important. I think that the second thing that's important about Latinx representation in video games more broadly is the context for Western audiences. Unfortunately, in a world where a lot of the depiction of Latinx individuals is related to shows about medical trafficking, like medicals that have internationally taken off, I think that it's made it difficult sometimes for Latinx game developers, but even comic artists to break through in the United States and the UK when they're showing a different perspective, because that's actually seen as inauthentic and it doesn't conform to stereotypes. And so it's hard to get buy in from investors, but also it's hard to get buy in from audiences because of stereotypes that they've grown up with. And I think that's something that our game does really well is that it actually shows those stereotypes in order to break them. That is to say, you are going to see the Spanish perspective that is perhaps familiar to you when you look at conquest history. We're not going to deny that account because that is one perspective, but we might challenge it. We might show an alternate character that has a completely different perspective on what happened in certain events. And in that sense, I think we disrupt traditional hierarchies.
Wow. You left me so speechless. It's extremely important, like you said, that it's done well and um, in the sense that um, just because I think it's kind of like when I was learning about US history, they paint it as a certain way from their perspective, and then from a completely different perspective, everything that was said isn't true, or it's kind of like fabricated. And I think that that does a lot of damage just because you're not learning the real history. And I think it's important to know that. And it's also important that it doesn't get lost, kind of just people accepting that that's what it was, that's what happened, and then just moving on. I think it's important that we all kind of learn about it, understand it, and know that, and kind of build from that and grow from that. But I think that was all the questions I had for you. So before we go, I did want to learn a little bit more about you because everyone here at Jaguar Games is an extremely huge Javaria fan, and you're just so interesting. You're so smart, and I want to know more about you. So I guess one of the questions that some of us had was that what is it that you love most about your field that you're learning about and that you look forward to learning more about every day?
Yeah, thank you. So in order to answer this question, I'll give you just a little bit of background about my own culture that I come from, which is that my parents' family are from Muddy, which are basically they're where the Himalayas end in Pakistan, and they have Muddy has an incredibly vibrant oral culture. It was one of the places that basically was never truly conquered by the British when they entered because of the mountainous regions. And so there's still a lot of indigenous peoples and indigenous languages that are spoken there, one of which my family speaks, which is like Bahari Patwari. And so I've always been fascinated by oral cultures and oral history. And I think something that my field specifically, which is colonial Mexican history, but specifically like indigenous history in Mexico, does very well is looking at oral accounts as legitimate sources of knowledge. That is to say, something doesn't need to be written in order to be true, and something specifically doesn't need to be written in romance or logographic forms, so like what we would recognize as words, in order to be a source of knowledge. This means that languages that perhaps are more pictorial or have symbols are just as valid as sources of knowledge as languages that are perhaps like romance, like Spanish or Portuguese or Italian. And I think that as someone who does come from an oral culture where specifically poetry was and is very important, I'm very drawn to Nahuatl poetry and the fact that even after the Spanish conquest of Mexico, you have all of these like records that are preserved of songs and poems and accounts. I think it resonates a lot with my own history and my family's own history under British imperialism. And as someone who studies empire more broadly, I look at that. What does it mean to resist empire? Is it only active resistance, or is knowledge preservation itself a form of resistance? So that's probably the thing I'm most excited about when I'm studying, which is like answering some of these difficult questions about empire.
No, I love that. I love how it's also still, even though it's like super far destinations from each other, they're still in a way connected. And I think that's so beautiful. And I guess another question I had, this is the last one, I swear. It would be why video games? What interests you about the field? Why did you want to get into like video games and things like that?
I think that unlike even I think the closest thing to the level of immersion that a video game allows perhaps is reading, right? Because reading allows you to imagine for yourself, but also see into a little bit of a character's thoughts and perceive perhaps their emotions in a way that television shows don't always allow even. And so I think that when I think about the ability to generate empathy for an important cause, as someone who is very pro social justice, but also decolonization, I actually think that the way to fight some of these important historical battles is through entertainment, because there's something disarming about having fun and play that allows you to consider alternate perspectives that maybe you wouldn't engage with in a serious way. So maybe you're someone who goes in being like, I think Marina is a horrible person. She was a traitor. I would never read a book about her. But when you see her as a character, you're like, I don't like her, but like I have to play her route, so I may as well give it a try. But I think that through seeing the different historical contingencies or maybe the limited choices you have as the person controlling the character, it might give you a level of empathy for some of the historical decisions that she made that you otherwise wouldn't have gained reading about her in an archive or watching a TV show about her where they have to pick one path. At the end of the day, they have to take one choice to be true, whereas video games can allow you to play with 5 or 6 options in every given path. And so I think that level of play is what I truly enjoy about games. I think play is understudied, especially in academia, and underrated. And that's why I love this collaboration between video games and academics.
Yeah, no, I think it's like you said, amazing. I think playing, especially games like this where we're exploring history, I think it's super important for us to be immersed, like you said, but in a sense that we're making the decisions, we're kind of putting ourselves in their shoes, putting ourselves in that time period and deciding, making decisions for that character. So I think that's amazing. But I think that's it for today. I'm extremely thankful that you had time to speak with me today. And I was extremely nervous because I've heard a lot about you and you're so smart, and I was really anxious to meet you. So thank you so much for taking the time to meet with me. And yeah,
Thank you so much for having me. And I hope that after meeting me, you are no longer nervous for when we hang out in the future.
of course. Thank you so much.